As most of us well know, there is a title given to the story that Adam shared in the children's moment that Toma just read for us. It is such a popular story that it has jumped from biblical understanding into pop culture, mainstream pop culture. The parable that Jesus read for us is called the parable of what? The Good Samaritan, that's right. Of course, all of us, most of us know that. Even folks who've never read the Bible use that language to reference a person who has done some good deed without expecting anything in return. The idea of the Good Samaritan is so prevalent that there are countless jokes and stories about the Good Samaritan that you could find online. In fact, do you remember, some of us might be old enough to remember this, the very last episode of the popular TV show Seinfeld? Right? The popular TV show Seinfeld, the very last episode, the main cast of Seinfeld were arrested for violating a Good Samaritan law. They witnessed a hijacking in Massachusetts, and instead of helping the person in need, they got out a video camera and began recording the carjacking and making fun of the victim of the carjacking, and that resulted in their arrest, trial, and conviction for not being good Samaritans. And this conversation right now got about as much popularity as that final episode did back in the 1990s. The entire final episode of this hugely popular series was based on a modern day understanding of a biblical text. Now, in popular culture, that's what it means to be a good Samaritan. To help someone in need, to give assistance to someone down on their luck. But for those who know the context of the relationship between, or more accurately, the lack of relationship between the Jews and Samaritans in Jesus' day, the story is a bit more complex than that. The mere suggestion that a Samaritan would go the extra mile or show any love at all for a Jew would not only have shocked Jesus' audience, it would have angered them. It would have repulsed them. Their disdain for one another wasn't just a minor disagreement. It was bitter, and it was violent, and it was ruthless. Think the Hatfields and McCoys. Biggie and Tupac, the Montagues and the Capulets. You get the idea. Love them? Those vile, nasty creeps? Those whose skin color is different from mine, those whose gender identity is fluid and not static like mine, love them? Yes. Yes, Jesus would say. Don't you get it? Your mortal enemy is not your enemy at all. They are your neighbor. Not only should you love them, but you should do all in your power to ensure that their needs are met for their well-being. This is a summation of all of Jesus' teachings. Love your neighbor. And I believe it just might prove a useful tool in helping us discern whether or not an ideology aligns with Jesus' teachings that those who are called Christians should be compelled to follow. We should be able to hold any thought or idea up against Jesus' command to love your neighbor and discern its validity as a Christian principle. For our purposes today, let's examine the ideology of Christian nationalism, an ideology that is rapidly growing in America. Now, I had lots of slides for definitions and understanding, so Christian nationalism encourages political violence. In fact, 40% of its adherents, 40% of people who proudly proclaim that they are Christian nationalists, say they agree with the statement that American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. This is the ideology that helped fuel the January 6th insurrection. Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy. This is why you will often hear the related term, white Christian nationalism. You may be wondering, well, how in the world can we spot Christian nationalism? How do we know it's not just patriotism? What is the difference? Well, this ideology shows up in politics and policy when Americans who embrace this ideology are likely to do things like approve of authoritarian tactics, like demanding people show respect for national symbols and traditions. Or it shows up in fear and distrust of religious minorities like Muslims, atheists, and Jewish people. It shows up in the belief that racial inequality is due to personal shortcomings of specific minority groups. It shows up when people report like being very uncomfortable with ideas like interracial marriage or transracial adoption. It shows up in those anti-immigrant views. It shows up in the fear of refugees. It shows up in the opposition to science and science education in schools. It shows up in the belief that men are better suited for leadership roles than women. It shows up in the idea that women should stay in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant. That is Christian nationalism. And the idea that this country that many of us love so much should be defined in exactly that way. Now, knowing all that, that's a lot to take in, isn't it? We must ask, how does that ideology square with Jesus of the Gospels? How does that square with the example of the Good Samaritan that Jesus gave to us? The Reverend Nathan Emsall answers that question like this. Where Christian nationalism spreads QAnon lies, Jesus says, the truth shall set you free. Where Christian nationalism incites political violence, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And where Christian nationalism spreads division and hatred, include and love our neighbor, no exceptions. This nationalistic version of Christianity is distorted completely away from a faith that gives us the Good Samaritan as an example to follow. Now, maybe you're thinking, come on, surely it's not that big of a deal. Surely it's just a small minority of people in this country who adhere to such a dangerous ideology. They're the ones causing all the ruckus. But let's look at the numbers. Let's see if that's accurate. According to Dr. Andrew Whitehead, one of the foremost experts on white Christian nationalism in the U.S., he breaks the U.S. population down into 4 major categories on the subject based on his research. He said, first, there are rejectors, those who strongly resist the privileging of the Christian religion by governing authorities. That's 21.5% of Americans. Next is the resistors. Now, like rejectors, these individuals oppose the government endorsing or advocating for Christian faith or values. But unlike rejectors, they're more comfortable with some public display or use of religious symbols. So think, for example, the 10 Commandments on the courthouse lawn. This group is 26.6% of Americans. Next is the accommodators, 32.1% of Americans. These individuals generally endorse the favoring of the Christian religion or values by governing authorities. They often hold that America was founded as a Christian nation. Now, they may not assert that we should ostracize other religions, but they definitely want America to be Christian. Now, lastly is the ambassadors, of Christian nationalism. Those are individuals who support legislation and ruling that privileges Christian values and protects the public display of Christian symbols and activities. They fervently assert that America was founded as and continues to be a Christian nation. That is 19.8% of Americans. Looking at these numbers, we see that nearly 52% of Americans, either those accommodators or ambassadors, hold on to an ideology of Christian nationalism, making it more widespread than we thought. 52% of Americans agree that America is and should be a Christian nation. Now, that can be overwhelming to think that more than half of Americans hold on to this ideology in ways that they may not even realize. I know that this is a bigger problem than many people realize. And so it calls for a response from those of us in that 48% minority. And I count myself in that minority, you may not, but I will proudly proclaim that I am in the 48%. Let's think about how we as Christians might want to live a faith of love and full inclusion. One way that we're responding as a church is by co-sponsoring a resolution at the upcoming Denominational General Assembly at the end of July. Our church is one of 14 churches in the Disciples of Christ denomination to sign on to a resolution calling the wider church, all of the Christian church Disciples of Christ, to oppose Christian nationalism. A few months ago, our administrative council had some discussions about the resolution and agreed that the language of the resolution aligned with our mission and voted to support that resolution. Now, the resolution is very long, and I'm going to read all of it. No, I'm just kidding. For the sake of time, I'm just going to share a short portion of the resolution calling for action from the church. And it says this: be it resolved that the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, denounces Christian nationalism in all its forms as a distortion of the Christian faith, and commits to opposing it wherever it appears, for the sake of the gospel and the good of the human family. It goes on, be it further resolved that the church calls on its leaders and members to take every possible opportunity to speak out and act boldly against Christian nationalism, ensuring that the love of God known to us in Jesus Christ may not be distorted by this ugly and false appropriation of our faith, but proclaimed with generosity and grace to all peoples, from our doorsteps to the ends of the earth. In a few weeks' time, representatives of your church will stand before the whole assembly in our denomination and invite that whole church to stand with us in opposition to this dangerous and twisted Christianity. What a beautiful example of leadership in building a just community. But we also want to be intentional about the witness we share in our own neighborhood. That's why the Administrative Council and Mission Council of the church have been in deep conversation over the past several months about what a visible and public witness against Christian nationalism might look like for our church. Making bold statements in the public square can be scary, but it feels like that might be exactly what God is calling us to do. To reject the perversion of our faith and embrace freedom and inclusion with a visible statement on our own property. It is one thing for us to stand strongly against Christian nationalism inside the safety of our own sanctuary. It is another thing entirely to make that bold claim about our faith in full view of all of our neighbors and the broader community. But we can't very well sponsor a resolution at General Assembly calling on our leaders to speak and act boldly if we are not willing to do so ourselves, right here in our neighborhood. Let's be those leaders on whom we call, and let's lead the way. Now, if you still have questions like, Why now? Why does this matter right now? Or how in the world am I supposed to celebrate July the 4th after this sermon? Or where is that line between patriotism and nationalism? Or I'm not really quite there in opposition to this, so help me understand more. How do we talk about my differences? Or what type of visible witnesses are we even talking about on our property? You have great questions, and they deserve deep and rich conversation. That's why we've set aside 2 Wednesday evening conversations to talk through those questions and more, whatever you might think of. This coming Wednesday at 6 o'clock, and then July 12th, 2 weeks away, also at 6 p.m., both in person and online. Be a part of those conversations, and let's talk about how we can respond as a community to the growing threat of Christian nationalism. To find out more information on that, just go to downeyavenue.com. Finally, I want to close with this. I invite you just to picture in your mind's eye a few different images. Picture 3 men, eyes closed, hands folded in prayer, heads bowed, praying before a wooden cross that someone has hewn carefully by hand. Picture another man just to the left of them, wrapping his arms around a massive Bible that he's squeezing against his chest with his head lifted to the sky, eyes tightly closed as he prays. A crowd of people surrounding them with signs that read, "Jesus saves." Their hands lifted, their eyes lifted to the sky, calling on their God through prayer. At first glance, you might think you're looking at a church rally of some sort of outdoor revival, if you've ever seen one of those, but it's actually the images of an insurrection. These descriptions are all people who, once their moment of prayer ended, stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. You see, Christian nationalists have refashioned Jesus into a warrior Christ who is willing to smite enemies to restore America to a Christian nation by force, if necessary. They are worshiping a warrior Christ, son of an American God. And Jesus, the Jesus of the gospel, weeps. And so should we. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus said. Not your country, not your flag, not your anthem, your neighbor. And who is our neighbor? Your immigrant neighbor, your Muslim neighbor, your insurrectionist neighbor, your Democrat neighbor, your Republican neighbor, your Jewish neighbor, your gay neighbor, your trans neighbor. Love your neighbor, Jesus says. That flies in the face of an angry, hateful warrior God. Love your neighbor. For that is what it means to be a good Samaritan. Do this, Jesus said, and you will live. Amen.